Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is presented by Sports Field Management Association. This week is the second of our series of post-conference education. Our featured speakers today are Dr. Daniel Sandor, Collegiate Assistant Professor of Turfgrass Science at Virginia Tech, and also Dr. Tyler Carr, Assistant Professor of Turfgrass Science in the Department of Horticulture and Crop Science at The Ohio State University. Today, they will be presenting Data and Decisions, Applying Research in Sports Field Management Practices. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. However, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature. Please type them in and they will be answered during the presentation. So thank you all for joining us today. You can go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. And we thank you to all of you for being here on the call with us this afternoon. I'm Dr. Sandor. You can call me Dan. My colleague here, Dr. Carr, my buddy Tyler, as many of you know him, is also here with us this afternoon. And we're trying to think of what to talk about last year in terms of submitting a proposal. And one of the things Tyler and I are very passionate about is using science and data to help improve our decision makings. And we're also very excited to share our passion for this with all of you this afternoon. To begin with, one of the things I want to start out with is actually a quote. Now, this is something that Dr. Henry actually talked about in one of his presentations a few weeks ago in Salt Lake City. And he basically said at the end of one of his presentations, talking about many different treatments and products and things that they were investigating, he said, at the end of the day, it's important to be your own scientist. Be your own scientists. We saying this to a room full of sports field professionals and turfgrass managers, and you guys, so you young men and women and folks that are involved in the day-to-day operations of your ballparks and facilities. It's important that you be your own scientist. And you think about, well, I'm a sports field manager. I'm not a turfgrass scientist. I don't have a degree in a master's degree or a Ph.D. Well, you don't need any of that. You may not even have a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree. Don't worry about it. We say all the time that turfgrass management is an art and a science. So by nature, you are in your profession a scientist. It's important that we think about our professions in this manner. It's important that we enhance our professionalism. Think of it as a serious professional work, and that we're providing this service to our community or to the teams or to the athletes and to the fans. It's also important that we're scientists and respect in regard to our environment, thinking about all the different inputs and the ways that we are affecting the root zone and the plants and the atmosphere and all the things that go into preserving and being a good steward of the environment and sustainability. And ultimately, too, there's a fiscal responsibility as well that we have with being sports field managers and being scientists. We use science to make agronomic decisions, to make maybe budgetary decisions, but we can also use science to help us with our financial or economic decisions when it comes down to savings on different applications and practices.
Yeah, so like Dan said, that you as a sports field manager have to make many decisions, from fiscal responsibility to professionalism, labor, everything that goes in between. And SFMA has done a great job of putting together a BMP manual for you and to help you move forward in that capacity. But we also need to take this information that we're using through the BMP manual and use data to help us push the needle forward and increase that professionalism.
So one of the questions we're going to start out with this afternoon is thinking about how can sports field managers enhance their decision making, enhance your decision making, data and decisions. How can we be better scientists and make better decisions? Well, the first thing, and you guys are faced with a lot of different decisions on a day-to-day basis, of maybe an hour-to-hour basis, who knows? So we're going to kind of outline our talk for the rest of this afternoon here on this slide. First thing we want to encourage you to do in every situation is to not be afraid to ask questions. I tell my students all the time, I can't help you unless you don't ask me for help, unless you don't indicate that you don't understand something. I encourage students, to ask questions, to be curious, to, question me on things, to make sure I've done my homework as well. Don't be afraid to ask questions when you're making these decisions, whether it's management practices, whether it's new products, whether it's new alternatives, or promising alternatives. There's a lot of different doors that can be opened just by simply asking a question. There, Doug.
Yeah, and we need to use this data to inform decisions. In order to justify certain expenditures, determine what products to use, we need to be able to use data that's provided by us as researchers, provided by you, or provided by the industry.
We could also utilize science-based practices or research-based findings into our decision-making. A lot of these things, as Tyler mentioned, is based upon data, is based upon scientific evidence, and apply those in your decision-making.
And then we can conduct our own research. I think that's a really cool thing that we can all do. You don't have to have a PhD or a master's degree to conduct research. And we're going to go through a couple of ways throughout this presentation that you, as a sports field manager, can conduct your own research.
Right, the mouse wasn't working there for a second. So let's start out with the first one. Ask questions, and we're not going to go through all these. But Dr. Bob Carr down at the University of Georgia, he put out a publication in one of the trade journals a few years ago, or I guess 20 years ago now. And we have a few different articles and things linked here in the presentation. We provided a references slide or for your convenience at the end of today's presentation. So if there is anything you want to go back and review, and a lot of the folks like Dr. Carr, a lot of the authors of these articles, like Dr. Carr, have done a good job summarizing some of the things that we were going to speak about today. But what questions should I ask? You're telling me, Dr. Carr, Dr. Sandor, you're telling me to ask questions. Well, these are some good questions suggested by Dr. Carr and many of us in instances as well. When faced with decisions, these are conversations you don't, you can just think about, when you're making these decisions, whether it's to bring in a new type of tool or technology, a new type of product, a new type of application rate, lots of different situations where many of these questions can be effective.
Yeah, it gives you a complete well-rounded understanding of what you're doing, because a lot of these new tools, technologies, products have a significant expense to them. And so formulating an incredible understanding using questions like these will help you.
And asking questions will also maybe save you from some potential problems or things. And Tyler's going to cover a couple of different common scenarios that often end up when, why asking questions, to further emphasize why asking questions are important.
Yeah, so we're looking through some old literature coming into this, and we noticed this thing that some authors previously referred to as the axis of evil. And so we're just looking at a figure here, a simple bar chart of disease control from two different products and a control. And really what we see on this vertical axis, it goes from 75 to 95% disease control. But in reality, this looks like we're seeing big differences. It looks like there's a big jump from the control to the competitor's brand in the orange or yellow, and then to our brand. But when you take the axis all the way down to 0, it really looks like competitors' brand and our brand aren't too different. And so these are some ways that data can be manipulated to look like there are differences when there may not be differences. You don't necessarily have to understand the statistics of what's going on to be able to kind of have your guard up for what may be misleading potentially. And so there's also some interesting things that we see often, and it kind of relates back to correlation versus causation. I like the term correlation does not imply causation, which really means just because I applied product A and I saw this response doesn't necessarily mean product A elicited this response or caused this response. So we found some off Tyler Vigen's website, some interesting correlations. Other things may be causing certain responses. For example, per capita cheese consumption is correlated with number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. I'm assuming that other things really attributed to the people dying by becoming tangled in their bed sheets, but maybe they, ate some cheese earlier. I don't know. Maybe they're from Wisconsin. I'm not sure. But this is just something to think about, because especially in turf grass, in the environment, there are so many different things that can go into a result. And so being skeptical of trying to understand what the underlying mechanisms are is really, really important.
So Tyler, you're telling me that I can eat all the cheese and I'll probably be fine?
Yeah, just be careful in bed. Be careful.
I don't eat cheese in bed.
Okay, also something when you look out for is selection bias. This is when you're comparing one thing without a true understanding of what you're comparing it to. So something we see is like this quote: "This product is guaranteed to increase nitrogen uptake by blank percentage." We don't know, but really we want to understand compared to what. Also another one could be, this cultivar requires X% less pesticide or water or fertilizer. Literally input your input, but compared to what? We don't really understand, or we can't really make a good comparison unless we understand what it's compared to. You could be comparing a cool season grass to a warm season grass when you should be comparing them to cool season grasses, for example.
It's very important to, ask these questions, whether it's an axes, whether it's correlations, or whether it's, product claims and allegations or promotions, to always ask these questions and do your homework when you're in communication with your partners and vendors and things. And, just make sure that you are using science, you are being scientists and making good decisions. And we've kind of answered this question in these previous slides here. Why is it important to utilize research-based evidence? And there are a lot of traps and pitfalls or problems that can arise if we aren't being good scientists and asking good questions and making good decisions. But one of the things that Tyler and I want to talk about now is thinking about, well, what does the value, why is research-based evidence key for helping me as a sports field manager, helping you as a sports field manager improve your decision making or make better decisions for your facility? And what it really comes down to is the scientific method. And this is something that Tyler, myself, our advisors in grad school, all our colleagues across the country, whether they're turf, ag, whatever, we're utilizing this approach. This is something that you utilize probably in high school or in sixth grade biology class. You implemented some type of scientific method to conduct your laboratory experiments. So we're going
I hope we're not bringing up too many bad experiences from high school laboratory dissecting a frog.
Well, we're going to spend the rest of our time this afternoon, or the next section of this time this afternoon, talking about these different steps within the scientific method, but also help you understand how you can utilize the scientific method at your facility and conduct your own experiment following these 4 steps. So go ahead, Tyler.
So really, this is what we do all the time. We're out at our facility and something's going on and we observe it and we have questions about why are we observing this? So this really is the basis for formulating any type of experiment or understanding from a science standpoint.
Yeah, so and you guys have problems. You guys have questions. We've known this for the past 20 some odd years, thanks to John Mascara and his photo quiz. There's a lot of things just based upon observation of how research projects and studies get funded and conducted, just by sheer genuine curiosity. Which Tyler and I went to school a few years before we started at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Richards and Dr. Carr, they just by chance, happened to spray out some wetting agent on a warm season putting green area, and they realized they observed the next spring that that area where the wetting agent was applied was quicker to green up. And that's kind of how that practice was birthed, just by a happy accident or a surprise accident there. But sometimes things happen in your facility that just incidentally or just happen, and then you observe. It's like, oh, well, I wonder if this phenomenon is actually just a one-off or if it's actually something that might happen. Sometimes, though, in many situations, we see and hear from sportsman managers across the country, y'all are facing challenges. Y'all are facing challenges, whether it's obviously with labor, but also with maybe pesticides or fertilizers or equipment or other management practices, and you're required to look at other alternatives. And so these are different ways that this observation portion of the scientific method starts working.
And then the next step is really hypothesis testing. And this is where we take these observations that we have and the questions we have, and we kind of take some of our basic understanding and of these items, our assumptions, the relationships, and the likelihood, try to understand why or formulate certain types of questions based on our general understanding of the subject area. And this is really where we kind of place like a statement of, we assume that this is going to happen in the experiment compared to some other type of result.
Yeah, and so we often hear this called a hypothesis test. And maybe you may or may not hear this a lot from researchers at the SFMA conferences or other workshops or things, but this is kind of the next step in that scientific method. But the one that you're probably most familiar with is the research objective. And this is basically, what are you trying to learn? What is our main goal or objective? How can we improve our understanding of a certain, effect or practice or phenomenon or application or management practice? And how can that help us make better decisions? As graduate students, we had to basically write a literature review, an entire background on previous research, and because it's to help us identify gaps in the literature. What don't we know?
That's what they were just doing that to torture us.
Yeah, well, yeah, that too. It took me about 2.5 years to write mine. But what don't we know? What questions do we need answered for, and how can we make better decisions? So a lot of times you'll see these written out in different presentations or slides, or even in trade publications, and certainly in scientific publications as well.
And these can be questions that are answered among research objectives or things that could be formulated, in your group text with other sports field managers. I mean, Dan and I and our colleagues are in group text, and we ask similar questions to try to develop objectives. So these types of things are collaborative for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep those relationships going. So the next portion of the scientific method, next step, again, these are things that you can do at your facility, is basically, maybe the materials and the things that you're already doing, agronomic practice. So we basically classify this or simply call this materials and methods. And think about materials as the things that are required to conduct the experiment or to carry out the experiment. And then the methods are the protocols that you utilize to implement different treatments and management practices. So we're going to look at these a little bit more closely.
If you guys were in person, we'd be asking people to raise hands about who cooks, because materials are really your ingredients and the methods that's your recipe. And that's,
we were talking about this earlier this afternoon, and Tyler is making me hungry, but he makes a great point. Think about this as your kitchen and your recipe and your ingredients. So the materials could be your ingredients, what you need, what is required for making that recipes. And there's actually a lot involved that a lot of people aren't aware of. I know when I was an undergrad, and I didn't really realize what all went into research, and this is not even an exhaustive list here on the screen. But it really starts with an experimental area, and what are the conditions? What space do you have to conduct an experiment, and what are the parameters of the logistics, or I guess the demographics of those space. Think about if you were to make a recipe in your kitchen, are you going to have to go to the store to get an ingredients, or do you already have all the ingredients on hand? One of our colleagues, Dr. Eric Watkins at the University of Minnesota, we've got this article linked at the end, but he actually wrote a really nice one-page article in Golf Course Management a few years ago, asking the question, how much does turfgrass research cost? And he does a really good job breaking down just the estimated cost of funding a 2-year master's project. But I think about all of these things as your ingredients.
Yeah, and then from a method standpoint, like we said, the methods that's like the recipe, and without a sound recipe, I mean, I messed up on a recipe. You end up with a poor product, and you end up getting something that's not repeatable. But these methods really come down to how the area is maintained, how the treatments are applied, the frequency, the intensity, and then your different ways that you're collecting data from this experiment. One thing that I think is really important from a method standpoint is to really go back to the objective and try to understand, okay, what are we really trying to get out of this experiment? And so that we can collect the data that's really only pertinent to answer your question, because we all don't have enough time to get everything done. And if you're collecting lots of data, you may never get to it, and it may not make a difference. But be diligent with your time and collect data that is really only necessary.
One of the things that we do as researchers, and it's something we definitely encourage y'all to do if you do start conducting your own experiments at your facility, is to make your comparisons and include an untreated control in your list of in your treatment regime. If you want to evaluate different mowing heights, if you want to evaluate different fertilizer rates or different pesticide rates or products, then that's fine. Do those experiments, but always include an untreated control. And you'll see this in the literature. You'll see this in slides. Saw it in a number of slides in Salt Lake City last month. I guess it's still January, but a few weeks ago, the abbreviation UTC, or sometimes you may see this written out as non-treated control. This really is something that you see a lot going into our next point in experimental design. So think about, again, we have our ingredients, we have our kitchen, we have our recipe, but now let's think about this in a field situation. We've got to actually randomize and replicate our treatments in our studies. So we're going to share a few different experimental designs that are pretty common in turfgrass research. Good, Alex.
Yeah, so the first one we have, and let me preface this by saying, we don't necessarily expect you to go out in your field and put these experimental designs out. We're saying this because we want you to have an understanding of what this is, and when you read different types of literature, that you're familiar with it. So the first one we have is a completely randomized design. A completely randomized design takes essentially what we have here is a grid, and we have a treatment A, which is blue, treatment B, which is green, and treatment C. Is that a red or a pink, Dan?
Might be a pink.
All right, we're going to go with pink. So we have 3 treatments and an untreated control, and they are completely randomized throughout this grid. From here, well, I guess I already answered this question. We have 3 treatments and an untreated control. And then how many replications? Really, we just count this by how many, let's say, for example, treatment A's do we see? I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4. So with completely randomized design, these treatments can land anywhere in the experimental area. That's contrary to what we typically experience with some of the other designs that we'll talk about in the coming slides.
One of the biggest things to think about, though, whether you have 2 treatments, 10 treatments, 18 treatments, is you need to include replications. It's very important that, and as researchers, we have to typically, rule of thumb is a minimum of 3 replications of each treatment factor. So we have, here we have 4 replications. We have more than the typical minimum. And again, think about your methodology and what is sound. You don't probably never have the opportunity, or rarely have the opportunity to include 5 or 6 replications, but generally 3 or 4 is pretty much the standard across the board in most field research trials, at least. But as Tyler mentioned, there are some limitations with a completely randomized design compared to a randomized complete block design. Now we've included another treatment on this screen, so now we have basically 4 treatments and an experiment and an untreated control. So whether you count that as 5 treatments or 4 treatments plus the control, we've increased our treatment level. That's not really what makes this an experiment, a randomized complete block design, however. But what you do see is kind of these arranged more in columns. You can see they're more emphasized. And within each column, each treatment, they're still randomized within each column, but then each treatment only appears once in each column. And this is a really good strategy that you can utilize at your facility. If you wanted to set up a randomized complete block design to account for things like variable things like shade or maybe slope. Maybe you have poor drainage in one area of your practice field or wherever you're using as your experimental area. We do this all the time. We do this blocking all the time in research situations to account for those similar things. So thinking about how many replications that do we have? Well, we still have our 4 replications in this example. This is a really common example.
Yeah, and so every single treatment is within each block. And like for the reasons Dan said, I would go out and say that this is probably the most commonly used treatment design that you will see in outdoor field experiments. Completely randomized design you may see in some greenhouse type experiments, but this is just another example. I would say the majority of my the trials have been randomized complete block design.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, Dallin.
Go ahead.
The next experimental design that we have, I know, right? We're so insane. The next experimental design that we have is the split plot design. And this is actually including another treatment factor. This is kind of another level, or taking the randomized complete block to another level. But this is, again, very practical for you as sports field managers where, we're trying to impose another maybe realistic practice, like mowing height, for example. We still have our treatments. Let's say, for these past couple of slides, we've been talking about a fertilizer treatment or a pesticide treatment, treatments, A through D or A through C, and then our, non-treated control. Well, now we want to also think about how mowing height would affect these treatment applications as well. Maybe mowing height 1 is the standard mowing height that, you would always utilize, and the mowing height 2 would be maybe you're lowering the mowing height or raising the mowing height. Maybe it's a frequency based mowing treatment. And so one of the things with a split plot design is that we still have our, we have 2 mowing height treatments. We have 3, let's say pesticide treatments plus an untreated control. But then our replications are now set across in rows. And part of the advantage or that the split plot design provides us is with something like mowing, where we have, it's going to be very hard for you as a sports field manager, for us as research, to take a mower and get a mower within a 5x5 plot, a 4x4 plot, whereas we can just mow across the strip. Another synonymous term you may hear in presentations or in literature is a strip plot design. You can see here that while this red, it has both mowing heights in it, these treatments are randomized. The pesticide treatments are randomized within each of these whole plots. Think of the mowing heights as whole plots, and the treatments, the herbicide treatments or these pesticide treatments as our split plot designs. We still do have our minimum of 3 replications within this experimental design.
Yeah, and I think one of the easy ways for while it doesn't include replication per se, but an easy way for you to go out and evaluate products and test efficacy is by using a check plot. Going out when you're spraying your new fertilizer product and put a plywood board down and spray over it, or an old piece of artificial turf, just to see and test the efficacy of it. If you want to try a new product, you can't necessarily justify that expenditure, and you test it for a period of time, that may help you justify that expenditure. This picture on the top right is an accident. They missed this spot when they were applying a herbicide. But sometimes these are what we need in order to confirm the efficacy and validate what we're doing.
Yeah, Matt Gourlay is a superintendent, a golf course superintendent up in Canada, I believe. Now think about the message he can tell to his superintendent, to his golfers, of why they need to apply, that herbicide, why it's important in their budget, in their, operations budget or pesticide spraying budget, why it's important to hire a spray tech. Now think about all the justifications. Go back to your research objectives, all the things you can use this data for, and even if it's not in a full-out experiment, like the 3 designs we previously talked about, these check plots, so they're small in size, they can also send a pretty mighty big message to your supervisors and colleagues of justifying why you need certain products and things. One of the things that our colleagues, Dr. Straw, many of Chase Straw, many of Dr. Kylie Dixon, they've been preaching this message of using mapping. And I can't forget one of my colleagues here at Virginia Tech, Dr. David McCall as well. Utilizing mapping, and while you don't need a drone or any type of big time technology just to make basic maps, this is something from Dr. Straw's research when he was, I think, a master's student at the University of Georgia. But most of you have, aside from baseball fields, you have mostly square-sided or right-sided field setups, and you can make, if you ever played Battleship growing up, any type of grid pattern on your field, and just go out and collect your own data and use that to help make your informed decisions. Well, this isn't necessarily an experimental design. It's something that you can start monitoring, and understanding what your field is telling you, and collecting that data and making better decisions.
And this can help attribute to site-specific management too. So you can, instead of focusing on the sidelines of a field, you may just focus on the middle part of the field. Justify those decisions.
This next section of the scientific method, and we're still, thinking about, all the steps involved in making better decisions and actually utilizing published research findings to improve our decision making, is we now collect the data based upon all those treatments that we've applied, and every single replication of the experimental design. We start making these measurements and these observations, whether it's subjective or objective measurements, and then we'll have to analyze the data and then share that data, just like all of you who went to Salt Lake or have been to previous conferences or your local or state regional conferences. You read, you hear, you see those findings come to life on the paper or through word of mouth. But think about data collection. There's a lot of different ways we collect data. Here, Dr. Eric Watkins at the University of Minnesota, this is a really common way if you've ever been to a turfgrass experiment station at your local university. Turf quality is pretty subjective from turfgrass scientists, and even from species to species or other management factors. But, this is the exciting life when people ask, what do we do? Well, we're turfgrass scientists, and, what does that mean? Well, we can show them this picture of Eric standing there just in a field of green. But, sometimes, there's a lot of observations to take, just with our human eyes. Sometimes we like to get really up close and personal, as Tyler did with his lysimeter in the Kentucky bluegrass. But again, these are subjective measurements. But another way, or maybe a beneficial way when we're thinking about improving our decision-making, is through objective measurements. This is Tyler utilizing what we call a light box. You probably have heard of this. It's very common in research within the past maybe 15, 20 years or so. Actually, the protocols were developed by our former advisors, Dr. Carr and Dr. Richardson, back in the early 2000s. This was caught on pretty much nationwide in many land-grant institutions or land-grant university turfgrass programs. One of the things that this helps us do, and thinking about you as a sports fair manager, while you may not need a light box, you can certainly utilize your phone or any type of digital imaging device that you have and go out and take pictures. And we can take this picture and then put it in a computer program, and it can actually estimate on an objective, by using an objective means, how much turf is in that plot, or how green is that turf, or this is an establishment study, how much turf is covered and established in that plot. There's a lot of other data collection tools that you can utilize, and we know all of you, many of you don't have all of these devices, and not that you necessarily need all of these devices. Again, go back to what the objectives are for the research or the experiment that you want to conduct at your facility. At the end of the day, Tyler and I are thinking about this in our talk, in our preparation for this talk. And one of the best data collection tools that you could have at your facility is just a soil probe. Taking soil samples and getting a soil test report, reading a soil test report can tell you a lot, can give you a lot of useful data for your facilities. But many of these tools, whether it's a shear strength tester, a clay gammer, or a TDR moisture meter to monitor soil moisture, these are all different tools that we utilize to objectively collect data in sports turf research.
Yeah, and even if you're using these tools to collect data, maybe you're in an area that has traffic versus no traffic, or two different levels of traffic, or you're mapping a field. These different tools, maybe with the exception of the soil probe, but there are lots of different tools that you can use to map your field, and some of these are pictured here.
Now, in terms of data analysis, one thing that Tyler and I are going to encourage you to do, because this is something that you likely don't have time to do as a sports field manager. You may not even want to do this, and there are times that Tyler and I don't want to do it either. Just to be frankly honest. But and this is one of the things warnings in terms of collecting too much data is we've got to analyze it now. Again, following the scientific method, let's analyze it. There's lots of different software programs. There's lots of different things. You hear a lot today about people young people now, becoming more computer engineers, computer programmers and things. There's a lot of different statistical software out there that, if you do end up collecting a bunch of data, we'd encourage you to partner, to collaborate with your local university researchers. Most of them are pretty happy to help you out with designing these experiments, with collecting data. They may have a grad student that can come out and collect the data for you while you can continue about your day-to-day business. So ironically enough, the SFMA and their sports field management publication beginning this past month is starting a feature on higher education turfgrass science programs. I think they had Texas A&M University and the University of Auburn, I believe, was the other one that they featured this past month. So if you're curious in terms of where is my local school, they may come up here in the next few issues. The SFMA as well, the SAFE Foundation, which helps to support graduate students and undergrads, members of the SFMA. Those graduate students benefit from the foundation in helping you conduct research, possibly at your facility or in the field at their research experiment station.
And a lot of times these researchers would love to be with you through inception of these things, because they will help you from the get-go. They'll help you figure out exactly what you need to do to answer your question, just like with what Dan was saying in the second bullet point here. And then this is a pretty much a list of the land-grant institutions in the United States. The land-grant institutions with that are red or orange, the 1862 land-grant institutions, are the ones that typically will have or have had turfgrass science programs. At this link at the bottom here, this go.osu.edu/turf programs, has a list of land-grant institution or turfgrass programs in different states of the United States. Now, some of them are not active anymore, but even if it's an adjacent state, there are people all across the state, all across the country, who are willing to assist in this. This is what we are here for. It doesn't matter if you're in Florida and I'm in Ohio. If you reach out, I'm willing to help. I know Dan would do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also turfgrass programs. I went to one. I went to Western Kentucky University for my undergrad and my master's. And while we were in a land grant school, we definitely have the means to help you or with your experimental designs, with your analyses, and other things as well. So we also want to include our non-land grant programs here that are turfgrass science programs. A lot of them have done great. Lots of bright young men and women in the Turf Bowl and the student challenge. So this is not by all means the end all be all, but these are the ones that would historically have the funding and the resources to fund scientific research. But as Tyler mentioned, some of these are no longer active, but you might be able to call those departments and find where those turf-grass scientists are, even if they don't have a full-fledged program. Lastly, though, thinking about data dissemination, again, we've talked a lot about science. We've talked a lot about research, and you may think, well, am I expected to publish my research or my experiment? And we're not, trying to get you to conduct any research just to, with publications, but we want you again to become better decision makers, to be your own scientists. Tyler and I, part of our responsibility as turf-grass scientists is we conduct the research, we analyze the data. Now we've got to write about it and get it published. And utilize it to have it be and submit it for peer reviewed or reviewed by our peers to, ensure and to question and to verify that this is a sound, valid research project. And we go on to publish these in many different scientific literature. You see, these are our three most common, or three, I don't know, most common, three more widely known publications that many of the turf-grass science world is publishing in. But you don't have to, conduct your research or only look to these things to learn from scientific-based research and apply those findings in your day-to-day management practices. Sports field management is a great place to start. A lot of trade publications, sports field management, other publications will often have the same or similar articles. They're just abridged or summarized in a less technical way. To make it where it's more or more readily applicable to you as a practitioner, to you as the sports field manager. Other options include, partnering again with your local university professors and turfgrass teams. Kansas State, when Dr. Hoyle used to be there, he had a turfgrass blog. I know at the University of Minnesota where I used to work, we had a blog for our program. Volunteered to write a blog for the local university turfgrass program. I'm sure they would love that. I know a lot of schools now across the country, they've partnered with the Turf Zone to develop monthly magazines or quarterly magazines. Another trade publication, one we have here in Virginia, that's highlighting one of the research projects we're doing with golf course superintendents as well. So there's another option for you. How many of you guys have been to research field days? This is an opportunity for you as well. Yeah, we'd love to see you all at research field days. We would love to do a study and then let you come and talk about it, whether it's at Ohio State, whether it's at Virginia Tech, wherever you may be, disseminating the data, at these research field days. A lot of times this is where these new questions and new projects actually are birthed by seeing something at a field day and then talking with Tyler, talking with me or any of our colleagues and say, well, what if you do this? Or at my facility, we're stuck with doing this, or we face this issue. And that is, to us as scientists, it helps us think about, oh yeah, that's something else we should investigate as well. One of the things, and I just kind of learned this recently, is that sports field management, they actually have a podcast. Data is disseminated on those podcasts as well, findings as well. That's something that you can learn from. That's something you can contribute to if you can end up conducting your own experiments and partnering with, local university researchers. Or, by good old word of mouth. Here's Dr. Carr here talking to the crowd, but this is a scene that we all saw a few weeks ago in Salt Lake City where, whether it's Dr. Henry or Dr. Bigelow or many of the other faculty that were there and academics that were there, or even sports field managers. It wasn't just PhDs and professors. It was a lot of sports field managers giving talks as well, and sharing data from projects they had worked on. These are all different ways that data can be disseminated, and this is the ultimate step or the final step of the scientific method.
And sports field managers love to hear from other sports field managers. So if you have things that you want to talk about, you have something that's really cool that you think can help other people, let the people know who organize these types of things, and they'll find ways to get you on the program, I'm sure. Okay, so now we take everything that we've really kind of gone through, and we need to figure out now how to interpret the research that is conducted from a university standpoint or an academic standpoint, because it can be kind of difficult to interpret.
Yeah, it can be. Those research publications that I've started reading even in grad school or even now, and I'm like, I don't understand what's going on or what's happening at all. And that may be something that you as a sports field manager, if you're looking at a publication or an article you're just get completely lost. I know we've all been there before. We may all still be there. One of the biggest things to think about though is where to start. Maybe it's an issue or a topic. Maybe you're dealing with irrigation or fertilization or something. One of the best databases out there in the world in terms of turfgrass research is actually called the Turfgrass Information File Database. And you actually have access to this here under your profile as a SFMA member. It's highlighted here on the left side menu. It's TGIF, and this is what it looks like. This is the Michigan State University Libraries. Dr. Beard and his collection, one of the pioneer of turfgrass research that many of us have continued to use today, this database. And you can look by different topics or different contents. You can even, if you're not interested in the scientific literature, they have lots of full text resources available with many trade publications, whether it's sports field management or sports turf, as it used to be called, older magazines, even some state publications as well, state turf journals and bulletins as well. But one of the things that Tyler and I want to help you guys with to close this afternoon is understanding scientific literature in case you do see this at a conference or at a meeting, or even if you get your chance on the article. Tyler talked about a minute ago how we love just exchanging ideas, and a lot of you come up to us and ask, hey, can we get a copy of that publication? Or you'll see something published on Twitter and people will DM us and say, hey, can we get a copy of your publication? Well, absolutely, we're happy to share that, but we just want to help you properly interpret these articles. And there are a lot. There's a lot of different options. There's a lot of different publications that we submit or journals that we submit to, and it can become confusing or overwhelming at that first glance. So let's talk about all the components of a scientific publication, because again, this is what we want you as sports field managers. We encourage you, to start utilizing science-based findings to make better decisions. So let's start out with the abstract. So the abstract is basically the summarization of the research and what went on. Maybe you're in a hurry, we all have, we're all limited on time, it seems. You may not have time to dig deep into an article or dig very far at all. Read the abstract. It's a paragraph. It's one of the most challenging things for Tyler and I to write, for many of our colleagues to write. We're typically limited to under 300 words to summarize, 3-4 years worth of research.
You're calling us verbose, Dan.
Yeah. So, the abstract will tell you, kind of the objectives, some of the treatments, what was investigated, and a summary of the findings.
And then you had the introduction. This is what Dan and I were talking about how we wrote literature reviews for graduate school. This is just more condensed. This is all the background information, the hypotheses, the research objectives. This is the why we're conducting this research. This is where the gaps in research are. And this really helps tell the story leading into conducting the experiment that you will read about in the rest of the paper.
The next section will be the materials and methods, which again, as you've seen by now, if you haven't already, these research publications follow that scientific method. And so the materials and methods will include things like the experimental area, which is very important for you to consider. Where was this experiment conducted? Was it on a sand-based athletic field, sand-cap athletic field? Was this conducted on a native soil, athletic field? If this was on bluegrass and I have Bermuda grass, well, there's going to be some differences probably in your situation compared to the experimental site conditions as well. So always peruse this section and understand what these demographics, what these logistics, what these baselines were for the site where the experiment was conducted. Then we'll have a list of different treatment applications. We'll have all the tools and all the different instruments that were utilized, all the frequencies and the time, the time of year, the time of day, or whatever that different treatments were applied. One big caveat with scientific literature that we do want to warn you about is that a lot of these are imperial in metric units. As Americans, we love our imperial, units of measure. But as scientists and as researchers, we are required to publish our research in metric form. So that's another hang-up that a lot of people have with properly interpreting, or even just, sometimes can make you fall asleep if you have to interpret too many or convert too many things. Luckily, I think we all have cell phones now that can easily convert things for us. But we'd encourage you to reach out to the authors and see if they have a trade publication of the research available, or there's a lot of different resources online that can help you make those conversions. But that's one fair warning that you're going to start seeing these metric units pop up in scientific literature, typically around here in the materials and methods section. And then lastly, the data that was collected and the analyses that they utilized the procedures they utilized to analyze that data will also be included in this section.
And then the last section in papers are typically the results and discussion. Sometimes they're combined, sometimes they're separated. This is going to tell you what the environment was like during the experiment. And then there will be some different tables. We're going to go through some of these here in a bit. An analysis of variance table, or an ANOVA table, various data tables that can look in multitude of different ways, and then figures. So these are all to supplement the text and help the reader better understand what is being portrayed in the paper. And so, so the first one we're going to talk about, and then we have about 9 minutes left, is analysis of variance table. So when we conduct experiments, we're trying to determine if the treatments had a significant effect on something. In this case, we're looking at green turf coverage, and did treatments such as cultivar or irrigation significantly affect turf grass coverage? Now, when we talk about significance, we have these things called p-values, and we sometimes see them as prob f. Values that are less than or equal to 0.05 are significant, and greater than or equal to, or greater than 0.05 are non-significant. What we really mean by this is that we are 95% confident that the findings as a result of whatever treatment you're using is not due to random chance. So it's essentially just a probability, and we're basing it off of a number of 95% typically in turf research. So for example, here in this table, we have lots of less than 0.0001. Those are highly significant. But you also see some NS's, meaning that that the cultivar by irrigation interaction here did not significantly affect green turf coverage. And so this is more of a precursor to set up what the author will discuss subsequently in the paper.
Oftentimes when you see all of these effects laid out, these are what we call these sources of variation. These are either main effects or interactions of main effects. This is why the author will discuss these findings or these results, based upon which ones were statistically significant. Oftentimes you don't have just sections in your discussion of including things that were not statistically significant. So just a heads up there in case you are reading a paper and you wonder, well, I know they did this, they said this so in the materials and methods, but they never wrote about it. Go back and look at the ANOVA table, and it will help you see there's probably a reason why they didn't write about it, even though they did include it in the methods or the materials and methods section. One of the other things really quickly, as before we run out of time, with the ANOVA table, is sometimes you see it presented this way, where there are no numbers. This is a really common way to write ANOVA tables. And again, thinking about what Tyler just said with NS, non-significant, but a lot of journals or publications, it depends on it's the year that the publication, the article is published in the journal, but have started using these asterisks for these stars to indicate, 95% confidence or 99% confidence or 0.999% confidence. So again, if it's significant or highly significant or not significant, just make sure you read the table footnotes to better understand these ANOVA tables. Right, the next section will be in a table, we're just going to highlight a few tables for you as we close out today, just to help you, understand the scientific literature a little bit better, whether it's in a paper or whether it's, an SFMA presentation or a short course presentation. We're thinking about your ABCs. Let's go back to grade school. This is a table of data from that same study looking at 2 bluegrass cultivars and 5 different irrigation treatments. And one of the things we'll look at are the treatment means. We have 2 different columns here that I want to look at specifically. First one is in June. We see within the footnote, it says within columns, means followed by the same letter are not significantly different for an officious protected LSD. This is basically indicating to you that as we've analyzed the data statistically, these values here, let's, for example, for mallard, regardless of the irrigation regime, all of these values for mallard were similar in their green turf coverage for the month of June. However, when we get to snap, a different bluegrass cultivar, well, these were all statistically different in their green turf coverage compared to mallard. Even within snap, we have some variation with the 40% irrigation replacement, being statistically lower than 100 through 50% irrigation replacement. The other thing we want to point out too is with September, if we skip over here, we actually do have some with multiple letters. So that then indicates that these are not common, these are not different compared to maybe a couple other rankings. So even though A, B, and C, these are all statistically different, we do see that with mallard at 60% versus snap at 100%, they are statistically similar, with being at 64.5% green cover and 56.2% green cover because they both share AB. So that's one of the things that you want to look at are these mean separation letters when looking at data and tables for figures.
And this can be viewed in a different way too, by in bar chart format. Like Dan said, it's always important to look at the legend. Here it says letters that are similar are not significantly different, at an alpha of 0.05 according to Fisher's protected LSD. And so it follows the same structure as what he mentioned previously, but there's just a different way to look at it.
One of the ways of thinking about least significant difference that you see this outside of research publications is in a lot of variety trial data, especially with the NTEP database, the National Turf Grass Evaluation Program. You see this a lot and through many years as you're looking at these data. At the bottom of these tables, you'll have an LSD value, and it even has a statement. Kevin Morris and his team have done a good job of including how to interpret these LSD values and what they mean. So basically, if we're looking at the overall means for these entries, for these different cultivars in this trial, this is the Crippen Bitgrass trial from 2015 to 2019, and we look at the overall means, and we can utilize, instead of letters, we're now using numbers as our LSD values to separate our means, so to identify our statistical differences. So our LSD value is 0.4, so 8.1 minus 0.4 would be 7.7. So everything with 7.7 to 8.1 would be statistically similar. So these first 3 varieties, even though Nightlife is the highest performing one, Armor and Kingdom statistically are similar. Each of these columns here within these locations have their own unique LSD value as well. So if we were looking at Minnesota, the LSD value we would utilize or subtract from is the value of 1. So 8.7 minus 1 would be obviously 7.7. And so anything between 8.7 and 7.7 would be statistically similar.
So the last 2 things we have are measures of variability. One is standard deviation. And we really see this by using a plus and minus. So for one of these values, go ahead and give me a click. Let's just look at one of these values at the top, 51.6. This is just measuring the variability. This is how much the data differed across the area. So smaller values mean that there was less variable data. Larger values mean that there was more variable data. So sometimes you can see see this and help understand the accuracy and precision of the data. And then another way to look at this is through standard error. It's similar. It's not a plus minus. It just shows it to you visually. So here, standard error bars are presented as a means of statistical comparison. You see some of these, like box and whisker plots, essentially, some of them are taller, meaning that the data is more variable than the ones that are more narrow.
Right. So at the very end of each of these publications, sometimes it's defined or sometimes it's just the last paragraph in the discussion. It's a conclusion. So these conclusions will have, implications for you as sports field managers and applications that you can then choose or decide whether or not to apply them in your management practices. These are things that you'll utilize to, when it comes time to meet with your team or meet with your supervisors, to justify why you should or should not do X, Y, or Z, or utilize, product X, Y, or Z, based upon this scientific data and scientific research.
And then lastly, we want to connect with the authors. If you have questions about anything from a paper, the author's contact information is on the side and with an asterisk typically beside the name of the author to contact. And they're always willing to help. Yeah, and we encourage you to attend your field days. Maybe you got the copy of the publication, but you are having a hard time, or you just don't have the time to really sit down and digest it. Connect with the authors. Attend a field day, attend a workshop, attend the SFMA conference. We're always happy to help. Let's think about all the things we've discussed today. I know we're out of time, and this is our last slide, I believe. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Data and decision. How can we improve? How can you improve as a sports field manager? Well, the first thing is to start asking questions. And then, once you have data available to you, whether it's your own field data, whether it's research data, which is a publication, use that data to inform your decisions and apply these science-based practices or science-based findings to your management practices. One of the things that, Tyler and I talked about earlier today is, start doing your own research. Think about those questions that you can ask. If you're next time you're with a salesman or another professional or a vendor, ask if you can actually, set up a small little trial air facility, try a product on a trial basis, and ask your employer, hey, I want to utilize a practice field. I want to utilize this portion of the facility to set up a small little trial. Be your own scientist, as we started out saying this afternoon, and then justify these decisions going forward, using your data that you've collected or the data that's been published in scientific research. So with that, Tyler and I really want to thank you for your time. We kept you a couple minutes over. These are some resources that you can utilize. These are some of the articles that we've mentioned from many of our colleagues that have been published in the past as well. A lot of good technical bulletins and things for you to further utilize in your toolbox. With that, and we'll take some time, we'll take some questions if there's time. Both of us, our contact information is on the screen. We're both on Twitter as well. So feel free to give us a shout. Thank you. Thanks, guys. I saw someone raise their hand, but I'm not sure if there's a question. We probably needs to go through the Q&A box. And I know we are over.
That's okay. If we get that question, we can take time to answer it.
Yeah, Timothy, if you're still on, please ask your question in the Q&A box. We'd be happy to answer that.
All right, well, we'll see if he types that in. In the meantime, thank you, Dr. Sandor. Thank you, Dr. Carr. I enjoyed that presentation. Looks like he's active. Sorry, I was hoping he'd type that in.
It's okay.
Anyway.
He can reach out to us. Our emails are on the page. We're happy to chat with him.
Sure. If anybody thinks of anything they want to ask later, there's the contact information. Be sure to register and join us for the next few weeks of post-conference education. We do still have a few sessions coming up. So thank you, Dr. Sandor. Thank you, Dr. Carr, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So.